Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, whenever you're watching this video. This is Creative Writing 2, and we are in week 1. And we are going to look at the 7 basic plot archetypes. We have plot this week. That's kind of what we're focused on. You are going to be writing a one-act play here in the next few weeks. So we want to kind of get you ready. We're going to look at kind of like what happens in a story. We're looking sort of at classic literature and sort of the 7 archetypes. It can be argued how many the true archetypes there are to stories. 7, 9, 53. Ultimately, there's one sort of element of plot, and that is what happens. We're looking at 7 basic sort of what happens ideas. And that's what we're going to kind of look at and focus on this week. You're going to actually get to deal with all of them in your own writing, but then you're going to kind of focus on the one sort of plot archetype that you really, really like. And that's what your short one-act play will be based upon. So let's look at the very first plot line that we're going to look at. The plot archetype is overcoming the monster. And this is where you have sort of a supernatural, very sort of unbeatable villain, monster, and we have a hero, our protagonist, that has to then sort of defeat this monster to save his family, himself, herself, the community, the world. Classic literature, we have examples like Jack and the Beanstalk, where Jack had to either kill the giant or his entire village was going to be destroyed. More recent examples like Darth Vader would be a pretty classic example of a monster that Luke Skywalker had to overcome. Even Mario had to overcome Bowser in the video game. So, we see these archetypes over and over and over again in different kinds of stories, from written stories to film to television to video games. So the next archetype is the rags to riches story. And rags to riches, typically also called the Cinderella story, where we have a protagonist who is sort of treated badly. They're sort of down on their luck. They're poor. Like Cinderella is a great example of the rags to riches story. She's briefly sort of brought up to greatness through kindness or talent, just to be put sort of back down into that. And at the very end, the climax is that character reaching back up and becoming great, or becoming rich, or becoming, what their potential is. A more modern version of this would probably be Annie. We see Annie in the orphanage, adopted for a week by Daddy Warbucks, and then of course at the end of the film, thrust back into greatness, and Daddy Warbucks finally adopts her, and she becomes a millionaire and happily ever after. And that's the second archetype. Next, we have the quest. And the quest is basically, we have a main character who oftentimes joined with, like a sidekick or a group of sidekicks, and they sort of embark, or they go on a journey to find some invaluable treasure. At the end, they not only usually find what they're looking for, but then they, of course, become either king or queen, especially in the classic literature. Win the heart of someone and fall in love. Some like classic examples would be like King Arthur and the Holy Grail. Like Monty Python and the Holy Grail would be kind of a newer version of that. Raiders of the Lost Ark with Indiana Jones, sort of going on a quest for the Ark. Next is the voyage and return. And the voyage and return, basically what we have here is a character, a protagonist, our hero, our main character, finds themselves sort of removed from their own world and sort of dropped or found themselves in a place that seems better than their own world, and then through the conflict they find out that there's no place like home. And Wizard of Oz is a great example of the voyage and return tale. you know, Dorothy was sort of thrust into Oz, and then realizes that it seems great, but you know, she misses home. Back to the Future is a new example of that. The Labyrinth with Sarah and the Goblin King is another example of the voyage and the return. Next we have the comedy. And the comedy is maybe a little confusing. It doesn't necessarily mean that the play or the story is going to be funny. It basically means that there's elements of kind of over-the-top confusion. Characters are sort of thrown into bewilderment, sort of put into a place or a situation that sort of shows them to be maybe worse than they really are, or you know, more confused than they should be. And of course, all of these sort of confusion bits play out, and at the end, everybody lives happily ever after. In a traditional Shakespearean comedy, there would be a wedding at the end. Much Ado About Nothing is a great example of that. You know, everything seems all messed up and totally terrible between, you know, the two main lovers. You know, the hero is sort of accused of being unfaithful, and at the end, of course, it's found to be untrue, and everybody lives happily ever after with a wedding. More recent example, maybe like When Harry Met Sally. Even Three's Company episodes, if you've ever seen that show, you know, oftentimes the plot comes from someone being confused, not quite understanding something that's happened. Next, we have the tragedy. And the tragedy is pretty much the exact opposite of the comedy in a lot of ways. In a Shakespearean tragedy, instead of a wedding, you would end with a death. We typically in a tragedy would see a hero sort of fall because of their own hubris or their own greed or their own sort of reaching too far. Hamlet is a perfect example of this, where Hamlet, trying to get revenge for his father's death, ends up sort of killing himself and everybody else as well because of his inability to, his inability to react, actually. He just sort of thinks things through, and doesn't actually do anything. Let's see. Let's move on to the last plot, and that is the rebirth. And hopefully you can see that. My PowerPoints are kind of all wonky today. Basically, the rebirth is the final plot line we're going to look at this week. Of the 7 main archetypes, this is the last one, where we find ourselves, we find a character, a main character, sort of thrown into this sort of dark, sort of unescapable problem. But through good deeds or through good acts, that character is sort of reborn into a better person. A Christmas Carol is a classic example of this. We have Scrooge sort of sitting kind of in the dark, thinking only of his profits and his money, just disliking people through the ghosts of Christmas past, present, and future. He's sort of reborn. He's shown what should be, and he becomes a better person because of the the sort of rebirth. The Lion King is a great example of that. More modern, where Simba, through the guilt of his father's death, he sort of kind of hides himself away, and then at the end he's reborn to be the great leader that he is to be. Basically, this is the 7 plot lines that you're going to kind of focus on and study this week. You're going to do some writing examples of these plot lines, so it's important that you understand these, and we'll see you next week.